The message arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a freezing February morning in 1942. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hadn't slept in 36 hours. His eyes burned as he stared at the endless rows of encrypted Japanese naval communications scrolling across his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor's Hypo Station, a dimly lit dungeon where America's best cryptanalysts fought their silent war. Rochefort looked more like a madman than a military officer. He wore a burgundy smoking jacket and slippers, refused to shave, and survived on coffee and cigarettes. His colleagues whispered that he was losing his mind. What they didn't know was that he was close, so desperately close to cracking Purple, the Japanese diplomatic cipher that everyone said was unbreakable. But this particular morning, something was different. The intercepted transmission contained a pattern he'd seen before, buried in the noise of thousands of messages. His hands trembled as he reached for his cipher worksheets, stained with coffee rings and covered in obsessive scribbling. The pattern repeated every seventh character. It was subtle, elegant, almost invisible. Almost. "My God," he whispered. What Rochefort couldn't have known in that moment was that his discovery would lead to one of the greatest intelligence triumphs of World War II and condemn hundreds of thousands of innocent people to death by fire. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor had been a smoldering graveyard. Over 2,000 Americans lay dead beneath the oil-slicked waters of the Pacific. The Arizona still burned. The nation demanded revenge, but revenge required something the United States didn't have: information. The Japanese Navy communicated using JN-25, a cipher system so complex it made Enigma look like a child's puzzle. Every message was encrypted twice, first encoded into 5-digit number groups, then enciphered using additive keys that changed daily. The possible combinations numbered in the trillions. Rochefort's team at Station Hypo consisted of barely 24 men working in a windowless basement that reeked of stale coffee and desperation. They were mathematicians, linguists, musicians, anyone with a mind that could see patterns where others saw chaos. They worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping on cots, eating cold sandwiches, their eyes bleeding from staring at endless columns of numbers. The pressure was suffocating. Every day they failed, more American ships went to the bottom of the Pacific. Every encrypted message they couldn't break might contain the location of the next Japanese strike. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, visited the dungeon personally, his face grave. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I need to know where they're going to hit us next. If you can't tell me that, we're going to lose this war." Rochefort felt the weight of those words, like a physical thing crushing his chest. He nodded, said nothing, and went back to work. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: garbage. One of Rochefort's analysts, a former Japanese language officer named Jasper Holmes, noticed something strange. In multiple intercepted messages, the Japanese kept referring to a location using the code AF. The frequency increased daily. Whatever AF was, it mattered greatly to the Japanese Imperial Navy. But what was AF? Was it a place? A person? A ship? Rochefort had a theory. He believed AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific, strategically positioned as America's westernmost outpost. But he needed proof, and the admirals in Washington needed certainty. The entire Pacific Fleet would be mobilized based on his guess. If he was wrong, it would be the end of his career, and possibly the end of America's chances in the Pacific. So Rochefort devised a trap, a trick so elegant it would later be taught in every intelligence school in the world. He sent a message through an undersea cable, one he knew the Japanese couldn't intercept, to Midway. The message instructed the base to send out a fake emergency transmission in plain English, reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down and they were running out of drinking water. Then Rochefort and his team waited, barely breathing, monitoring every Japanese transmission. 2 days later, they intercepted a Japanese naval message. "F is short of water." The room erupted. Men who hadn't smiled in months were laughing crying, embracing each other. They had them. They knew. Midway was the target, but cracking the code was only the beginning of Rocheford's nightmare. As the intercepts continued to flow in, he and his team decoded the Japanese battle plan with horrifying clarity. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was sending the most powerful naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers. Their objective was to annihilate what remained of the American fleet and secure Japanese dominance of the Pacific forever. The Battle of Midway, when it came in June 1942, was a slaughter, but not the one Yamamoto intended. Because of Rochefort's intelligence, American dive bombers knew exactly where to find the Japanese carriers. In 5 minutes of coordinated attacks, the entire momentum of the Pacific War shifted. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sent to the bottom of the ocean, taking with them over 3,000 men and Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. Rochefort listened to the radio reports from the basement at Hypo. He didn't celebrate. He couldn't. Because now, with the code firmly broken, every Japanese message was like reading a diary. He knew their ship movements, their supply routes, their strategic intentions. He could see everything, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. As American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, Rochefort's decrypts revealed something the public would never know. The Japanese military was preparing for total resistance. Intercepted orders showed that civilians were being armed with bamboo spears, that women and children were being trained as suicide attackers, that the entire population was being conditioned to fight to the death rather than surrender. The decoded messages spoke of Ketsugo, the decisive battle for the homeland. 100 million Japanese would become a shield of flesh and bone. Every city would be a fortress. Every citizen would be a soldier. Rochefort realized with cold horror what this meant for the invasion of Japan being planned for 1,946. The casualty estimates were staggering. 1 million American dead, 10 million Japanese casualties, military and civilian combined. But there was another option being discussed in the highest levels of government, an option so terrible that few dared speak of it openly. A new weapon had been developed in the deserts of New Mexico. A weapon that could obliterate an entire city in a single blinding flash. And Rochefort's decrypts would help choose which cities would burn. By the spring of 1945, Joseph Rochefort had become a ghost haunting his own life. He'd been promoted, decorated, and quietly pushed aside by jealous superiors in Washington who couldn't stomach the fact that a disheveled basement dweller in a smoking jacket had won the Pacific War from a chair. They sent him to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco, a humiliating demotion disguised as a transfer. But they couldn't take away what he knew. Every decoded message, every intercepted transmission was burned into his memory like a brand. And the messages coming out of Japan in early 1945 were the most disturbing yet. He still maintained contact with his former team, now designated the United States Fleet Radio Unit. They sent him copies of the latest decrypts, stamped ultra secret in red ink. Rochefort would read them alone in his quarters, a glass of whiskey in his shaking hand, and feel the weight of knowledge crushing him. One decrypt, dated the 15th of March 1945, detailed Japan's Patriotic Citizens Fighting Corps, a mandatory civilian militia that would conscript every Japanese citizen between the ages of 15 and 60, 28 million people. The message specified that civilians would be armed with anything available: kitchen knives, garden tools, sharpened bamboo poles. Another message, intercepted April 8th, outlined defensive preparations around Tokyo. The military had distributed thousands of ceramic grenades to schoolgirls, instructing them to throw themselves under American tanks. The grenades were designed to detonate on impact, killing both the girl and disabling the tank's treads. Rochefort closed his eyes and tried not to imagine it, tried not to see the faces of children turned into weapons. But the nightmare was just beginning. In May 1945, a courier arrived at his quarters with a sealed envelope marked for his eyes only. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of 5 Japanese cities and a question typed at the bottom. Your assessment of military value and civilian infrastructure? The cities were Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, Kokura, and Niigata. Rochefort stared at the list for a long time. He knew what this was. He'd heard the rumors whispered in classified briefings, seen the sanitized references in high-level communications. The Manhattan Project, the gadget, the weapon that could end the war in a single stroke. They were asking him to help them choose where to drop it. His hands trembled as he pulled out his files. Years of decoded intercepts, meticulously cataloged. He knew these cities intimately, not from visiting them, but from reading their secrets. He knew which ones housed military headquarters, which ones manufactured weapons, which ones served as logistics hubs for the Japanese war machine. Hiroshima. 2nd Army Headquarters. Embarkation point for troops heading to the Southern Front. Major manufacturing center, producing artillery shells and naval ordnance. Port facilities, crucial for military supply lines. But he also knew the other truth, the one they didn't ask about. Hiroshima had a population of 350,000 civilians. Factory workers, shopkeepers, families, children. He picked up his pen, then set it down, picked it up again. What right did he have to make this choice? He was just a codebreaker, a man who read other people's secrets. He wasn't God. He couldn't decide who lived and who died. But if he didn't answer, someone else would. Someone who knew less. Someone who might choose a city with even more innocent lives at stake. Rochefort poured himself another whiskey and began to write. What he couldn't have known was that his recommendations would be cross-referenced with dozens of other intelligence sources, aerial reconnaissance photos, prisoner interrogations, industrial surveys. But his assessment carried weight. He had proven himself at Midway. When Rochefort spoke about Japan, people listened. The Target Committee met in Washington on May 28th. Rochefort wasn't invited, but he received a summary afterward. They had narrowed the list to 4 cities. Kyoto was removed too culturally significant, the Secretary of War had argued. It would embitter the Japanese forever. The final 4 were Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. Rochefort felt something die inside him when he read those names. The decrypts kept coming through June and July. Each one made it harder to sleep. July 2nd, an intercepted message from the Japanese War Ministry to all regional commanders. The Empire will fight to the last man. Death before dishonor. Surrender is treason. July 15th. A transmission detailing the completion of fortifications around every major city. Over 2 million mines had been laid. Poison gas reserves were being moved into position, ready to be deployed against invading forces and against Japanese civilians if they attempted to surrender. July 21st. Perhaps the most chilling message of all. A decoded communication from Japanese headquarters to their embassy in Moscow, desperately seeking Soviet mediation for peace. But the terms were impossible. Japan would retain its military, keep its conquered territories, and face no occupation. The emperor would remain sovereign and untouchable. It was a fantasy. America would never accept it. Neither would China, after years of Japanese atrocities. Neither would the millions of people suffering under Japanese occupation across Asia. But it proved something important. Japan's military leadership would rather see their entire nation destroyed than accept unconditional surrender. Rochefort forwarded the decrypt to Washington with a single line of commentary. They mean it. They will fight until there is nothing left. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration was issued, calling for Japan's unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government rejected it within 48 hours. Rochefort sat in his quarters and tried to calculate how many would die in the invasion. The military planners had codenamed it Operation Downfall. It would be the largest amphibious assault in human history, larger than D-Day, larger than anything ever attempted. The first phase, Operation Olympic, would target Kyushu in November 1945. Intelligence estimates projected American casualties of up to 250,000 inches the first month alone. Japanese military and civilian deaths would be in the millions. The second phase, Operation Coronet, would assault Honshu near Tokyo in March 1946. If Kyushu was bloody, this would be apocalyptic. The entire population would be mobilized. Every house would be a bunker. Every street would run with blood. And there was another factor, one that made Rochefort physically sick when he thought about it. The decoded messages revealed that the Japanese had hidden stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons across the home islands. If the invasion came, they would use them. Plague, anthrax, mustard gas, anything to stop the Americans. The Japanese were preparing to turn their own country into a death trap, and they would take as many Americans with them as they could. On August 5th, 1945, Rochefort received a cryptic message from his former colleague at Fleet Radio. Package will be delivered to Address 1 within 24 hours. He knew what it meant. Address 1 was Hiroshima. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in his quarters with a bottle of whiskey and a file folder full of decrypts about Hiroshima. Troop movements, factory outputs, supply schedules, all the military data that had made it a viable target. But he also thought about what wasn't in the decrypts. The school children who had no idea what was coming. The mothers preparing breakfast for their families. The old men tending their gardens. The shopkeepers opening their stores for another day of business. 350,000 people going about their lives, unaware that tomorrow the sun would rise twice. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay released its payload over Hiroshima. 16 hours later, Rochefort received the damage assessment. The bomb they were calling it Little Boy had detonated 1,900 feet above the city with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at ground zero reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. People within a half-mile radius were vaporized instantly. Their shadows burned into concrete. Those further away suffered worse fates, flash burns, radiation poisoning, crushing injuries from collapsed buildings. The initial casualty estimate was 70,000 dead. By the end of the year, the number would climb to over 140,000. Rochefort sat with the report in his hands and felt absolutely nothing. His mind had gone blank, a protective numbness settling over him like snow. 3 days later, they dropped another bomb. Nagasaki, this time Kokura, had been too cloudy. 74,000 more dead. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For the first time in history, the Japanese people heard their God Emperor's voice. It was thin, reedy, almost breaking, as he spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. The war was over. Rochefort should have felt relief. He should have felt triumph. America had won. His work at Midway, his years of breaking codes and reading secrets, had led to this moment of victory. Instead, he felt like a murderer. The photographs arrived in September 1945, classified as top secret and delivered in a sealed manila envelope. Rochefort's hand shook as he opened it. He knew he shouldn't look. He knew it would destroy whatever fragile peace he'd managed to construct in his mind. He looked anyway. The first photograph showed what remained of Hiroshima's city center. It wasn't rubble. Rubble implies that buildings fell down. This was erasure. For nearly a mile in every direction from ground zero, there was simply nothing. The earth was scorched smooth, like a photograph negative. The only structures still standing were the skeletal remains of a few reinforced concrete buildings, their walls blown out, their interiors gutted. The second photograph was worse. It showed the Ioi Bridge, the aiming point for the bomb. The bridge itself had survived, twisted, but intact. What caught Rochefort's eye were the shadows on the bridge's surface, dark silhouettes of people who had been crossing when the flash came. The heat had been so intense that it burned their shadows into the concrete before vaporizing their bodies. They were permanent ghosts, a man with a bicycle, a woman carrying a bundle, a child. The third photograph showed a wall with a ladder's shadow burned into it. The ladder itself had disintegrated, turned to vapor in microseconds, but its outline remained, a perfect negative image preserved forever in scorched stone. Rochefort made it to the bathroom just in time to vomit. The nightmares started that night and never really stopped. In his dreams, he was back in the basement at Hypo. But instead of Japanese naval codes, the messages he was decoding were the names of the dead. They scrolled across his worksheets in endless columns. Tanaka Yoshiko, age 7. Nakamura Kenji, age 43. Sato Emiko, age 19. On and on, hundreds of thousands of names. And his hands kept writing, kept decoding, kept processing the death toll. Sometimes he dreamed he was standing on the Aoi Bridge as the Enola Gay approached. He would try to scream a warning, but no sound would come out. He could only watch as the bomb bay doors opened and Little Boy fell away from the aircraft, tumbling end over end in its descent. He would start counting 1, 2, 3, knowing he had 43 seconds until detonation, knowing he couldn't run, couldn't hide, couldn't do anything but wait for the sun to explode at ground level. He always woke up just before the flash, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart hammering. His wife found him one night, sitting in the kitchen at 3 a.m., surrounded by decrypts and photographs, tears streaming down his face. "Joe," she said softly, "you didn't drop the bomb. You just broke their codes." "I told them where," he whispered. "I told them where to aim. You saved American lives. Maybe 1,000,000 American lives." "I know," he said. "I know, but I can still see their shadows on the bridge." The official reports came in over the following months, each one adding another layer of horror. The radiation sickness was the worst part. People who had survived the initial blast, who had walked away from the ruins seemingly unscathed, began dying weeks later. Their hair fell out, their gums bled, their skin developed lesions that wouldn't heal. Their blood stopped clotting. They died, slowly, in agony, their bodies destroyed from the inside out by something invisible, something they didn't even have a name for. The doctors called it Disease X at first, then atomic bomb disease. The Japanese called it Picodon, flash boom, and watched helplessly as their loved ones withered away. By December 1945, the death toll in Hiroshima alone had climbed to 140,000. Nagasaki added another 74,000. And people were still dying, would continue dying, for years, for decades. Rochefort received regular intelligence updates about the occupation of Japan. American forces were flooding into the country, expecting resistance, preparing for guerrilla warfare, for suicide attacks, for the apocalyptic battle that the decoded messages had promised. It never came. The Japanese people, stunned into submission by the atomic bombs, surrendered peacefully. The Emperor's divine authority, that same authority that had driven millions to fight to the death, now commanded them to lay down their arms. And they obeyed. The caves full of hidden weapons were never used. The chemical stockpiles remained sealed. The 28 million civilian militia members went home, hung up their bamboo spears, and began the work of rebuilding. Operation Downfall was canceled. The invasion that would have killed millions never happened. Rochefort tried to take comfort in that. He tried to believe that the mathematics of death justified everything 214,000 dead from the atomic bombs versus potentially 10 million dead from an invasion. It was a simple calculation, a trolley problem written in blood, but mathematics didn't explain the shadows on the bridge. Numbers didn't account for the children who would be born decades later with birth defects, their cells damaged by radiation their parents had absorbed. Statistics couldn't capture the trauma of an entire generation, scarred by the knowledge that human beings had unlocked the power to destroy themselves. In 1946, Rochefort was quietly reassigned again, this time to a teaching position at the Naval War College. The Navy gave him a Distinguished Service Medal for his work at Midway, but the ceremony was private, classified. The public would never know what he had done. He tried to move on. He taught classes on cryptanalysis, trained a new generation of codebreakers. He never mentioned Hiroshima or Nagasaki. When his students asked about his wartime service, he would deflect, change the subject, redirect their attention to technical matters. But in private, he collected every piece of information he could find about the bombings. Newspaper articles, medical reports, survivor testimonies. He kept them in a locked filing cabinet in his home office, a secret archive of guilt. One article particularly haunted him. It was a first-hand account from a Japanese doctor named Michihiko Hachiya, who had survived the Hiroshima bombing and kept a diary of the aftermath. Dr. Hachiya described wandering through the ruins, trying to treat the wounded with no supplies, no water, no medicine. He described patients who seemed fine one day and were dead the next, their bodies simply giving up. He described the smell-burned flesh, rotting corpses, and something else, something chemical and wrong that hung over the city like a miasma. But what destroyed Rochefort was a single line near the end of the diary. The cruelest thing about the bomb is that it killed indiscriminately. The guilty and the innocent, the soldier and the child, all reduced to ash together. Rochefort read that line over and over until he had it memorized. Because Dr. Hachiya was right. The bomb didn't distinguish between the military headquarters and the elementary school 3 blocks away. It didn't care that Mrs. Yamamoto had never supported the war, or that little Hiroshi was just learning to read, or that Mr. Tanaka ran a bookshop and had never hurt anyone in his life. The code Rochefort had broken had given America the power to read Japanese military secrets. But the weapon he had helped direct didn't read anything. It just burned. In 1950, the Korean War broke out, and Rochefort watched with growing horror as the military began discussing the use of atomic weapons again. General MacArthur wanted to drop dozens of bombs along the Chinese border, creating a radioactive wasteland that would prevent Chinese forces from advancing. Rochefort wrote a classified memo to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, breaking his silence for the first time since the war. In it, he argued passionately against the use of atomic weapons except in the most desperate circumstances. He cited the long-term effects of radiation, the moral implications, the likelihood of Soviet retaliation. The memo was ignored. Rochefort was, after all, just a codebreaker. What did he know about strategic military planning? In the end, President Truman refused to authorize nuclear strikes in Korea, but not because of Rochefort's memo. The world had simply become too dangerous. The Soviets had their own atomic bomb now. The age of nuclear deterrence had begun. Rochefort realized with bitter irony that the weapon that had ended World War II had made World War III unthinkable. Mutual Assured Destruction MAD, they called it, and the acronym was grimly appropriate. Humanity now possessed the power to crack not just military codes, but the genetic code of life itself to unravel the very atoms that held matter together. And having unlocked that power, they could never put it back. The years passed. Rochefort retired from the Navy in 1953, just shy of his 54th birthday. He moved to a small house in California, tended a garden, tried to live quietly. But the dreams never stopped. The shadows on the bridge visited him every night. In 1960, he received an unexpected letter from Japan. It was from a survivor of Hiroshima, a man named Kiyoshi Tanimoto, who had become a Methodist minister after the war. Reverend Tanimoto had dedicated his life to helping other survivors, and he was writing to tell the American people about the ongoing suffering of the hibakusha, the bomb-affected people. Somehow, Tanimoto had learned of Rochefort's role in the intelligence that led to Hiroshima's selection as a target. The letter wasn't angry or accusatory. It was simply informative, a quiet testimony to what had happened and what continued to happen. Many of us still die each year from cancers caused by the radiation, Tanimoto wrote. Many of our children are born with defects. We carry the bomb inside us, and we will carry it until we die. I write to you not to condemn, but so that you will know, so that you will understand the full weight of what occurred that August morning. The letter ended with a single line. We have forgiven. Can you? Rochefort sat with that letter for 3 days before he could bring himself to respond. When he finally did, his reply was short. Reverend Tanimoto, I am grateful for your forgiveness, but I do not know how to forgive myself. I broke their codes, and I told my government where to aim, and I believed it would save lives. I still believe it saved lives, but belief and knowledge are different things, and I will carry the knowledge of what I enabled until my own death. I see the shadows on the bridge in my dreams. I suspect I always will." He never received a reply. He didn't expect one. What more was there to say? Joseph Rochefort died on July 20th, 1976, at the age of 76. The official cause was heart failure, but those who knew him best wondered if it wasn't something else, a slower, quieter kind of death that had been killing him for 31 years. In his final months, as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp, too sharp. The curse of a codebreaker's brain is that it never stops working, never stops analyzing, never stops trying to find patterns in the chaos. And the chaos of Hiroshima had no pattern. It was just death, random and absolute. His daughter found him one afternoon in his study, surrounded by newspapers. The headlines all screamed about the same thing. The Vietnam War was finally over. America had pulled out, defeated not by military might, but by will, by the sheer determination of a smaller, weaker nation that refused to surrender. "It's like Japan," Rochefort muttered. "They were willing to fight forever, but we didn't have the stomach for it. We left." His daughter sat down beside him. "Dad, you can't keep doing this to yourself." "Doing what?" "Replaying the war, questioning every decision. You did what you thought was right." Rochefort looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "That's the problem, sweetheart. I still think it was right, and I still think it was unforgivable. Both things are true, and I don't know how to live with that." In those final months, Rochefort did something he'd never done before. He agreed to be interviewed for a classified oral history project. The Navy wanted to preserve the stories of the codebreakers before they all died, taking their secrets with them. The interviewer was a young naval officer who treated Rochefort with reverence, calling him a hero, a legend. Rochefort waved him off. "Tell me about Midway," the interviewer said. "That must have been the proudest moment of your career." "Midway was easy," Rochefort replied. "I knew who the enemy was. I knew what I was trying to accomplish. The math was simple. Break the code, save the fleet, win the battle." "And Hiroshima?" the interviewer asked carefully. Rochefort was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Hiroshima was the opposite. I knew who the enemy was, but I also knew who they were. The decoded messages told us about their military, but I knew about their people too. I'd been reading their communications for years. I knew their hopes, their fears, their desperation, and I had to help choose which city would cease to exist." "But you saved lives," the interviewer said. "The invasion would have killed millions." "Would it have?" Rochefort asked. "I've spent 30 years asking myself that question. We decoded messages about Ketsugo, about the civilian militia, about the plan to fight to the last man, and I believed it. I still believe it. The Japanese military was prepared to sacrifice their entire population rather than surrender." He paused, staring at nothing. "But here's what keeps me awake at night. We never gave them a chance to prove us wrong. We dropped the bombs, and they surrendered. Would they have surrendered if we'd just shown them we had the bomb? If we demonstrated it on an uninhabited island with Japanese observers present? Would they have surrendered after one bomb instead of two? Would they have surrendered if we'd waited one more week, one more month?" "We couldn't risk waiting," the interviewer said. "Every day, more Allied prisoners were dying. More Chinese civilians were being massacred. More—" "I know," Rochefort interrupted. "I know all the arguments. I made them myself. But the problem with being a codebreaker is that you learn something fundamental about secrets. There's always more information you don't have. I broke their naval codes, but I never broke the code of the human heart. I don't know what Emperor Hirohito was thinking in those final days. I don't know how close they were to surrendering before the bombs fell. I'll never know. The interviewer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, with respect, you're being too hard on yourself. President Truman made the final decision, not you. Rochefort laughed, a bitter sound. That's what everyone tells themselves. Truman made the decision. I just provided intelligence. The bomber crew just followed orders. The scientists just built what they were told to build. Everyone's just a cog in the machine, and the machine has no conscience. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. But that's a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. I had a choice. When they asked me to assess those cities, I could have refused. I could have said, I'm a code breaker, not a target selector. But I didn't. I made my recommendations, and I justified them with data and analysis, and I told myself it was the right thing to do. Was it? The interviewer asked. Rochefort stared at him for a long moment. I don't know, and that's the code I can't crack. The interviewer returned the next week with a different question. He'd been thinking about their previous conversation, and something had been bothering him. Sir, if you could go back, would you do anything differently? Rochefort didn't hesitate. No? The interviewer blinked, surprised. But you just said... I said I don't know if it was right. That doesn't mean I would change it. Given what I knew at the time, given the information I had, given the stakes, I would make the same recommendations. The alternative, doing nothing, letting the invasion proceed, watching millions die in conventional warfare, would have been worse. Then why the guilt? Because intent doesn't erase consequence, Rochefort said. I meant to save lives, and I did. I also meant to end the war quickly, and I did. But I also vaporized 214,000 human beings, and poisoned hundreds of thousands more with radiation, and unleashed a weapon that now threatens the entire human race. All of those things are true, simultaneously. He pulled out a photograph from his desk drawer. It was one of the shadows on the bridge, the image that had haunted him for 3 decades. This was a person, he said quietly. A human being with thoughts and feelings, and people who loved them. Maybe they supported the war. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they were a soldier. Maybe they were a shopkeeper. I'll never know. The bomb didn't ask. It just burned them out of existence and left only their shadow. He traced the outline with his finger. This is the price of total war. This is what happens when nations decide that victory justifies any cost. And I was part of that. I don't get to escape responsibility just because I was following orders or doing my duty or trying to save American lives. I played my role, and this shadow is part of my legacy. 3 weeks before he died, Rochefort received an unexpected visitor. A Japanese professor named Takeshi Okubo had traveled from Tokyo to interview American veterans about the war. Someone had given him Rochefort's name. Rochefort almost refused to see him. But something made him agree, curiosity perhaps, or a desire for some kind of closure he knew he'd never find. Professor Okubo was in his 50s, polite and formal. He explained that he was writing a comprehensive history of the Pacific War from both perspectives, trying to understand how 2 nations had stumbled into such catastrophic conflict. I understand you were instrumental in breaking Japanese naval codes, Okubo said. I was part of the team, yes. And you helped select Hiroshima as a target. Rochefort felt his chest tighten. I provided intelligence assessments. I didn't make the decision. Of course, Okubo said gently. I'm not here to accuse you, Mr. Rochefort. I'm here because I think you might understand something that most people don't. What's that? The tragedy of necessity. Okubo paused, choosing his words carefully. My father was a colonel in the Imperial Army. He helped plan the defense of Kyushu for Operation Ketsugo. Do you know what he told me before he died? Rochefort shook his head. He said the atomic bomb saved Japan. He said that if the Americans had invaded, the military would have forced every Japanese citizen to fight. Women, children, elderly, everyone. They would have turned Japan into a graveyard. He said the emperor would never have been able to surrender under those circumstances. The military would have overthrown him first. Okubo's eyes were bright with unshed tears. My father said the atomic bombs gave the emperor an excuse, a reason powerful enough to override the military's death wish. He could tell the nation, "We face a weapon against which we cannot defend ourselves. To continue fighting would mean the extinction of our race." It was the only argument that could have worked. Rochefort felt something break inside him. A wall he'd been holding up for 3 decades. "Does that mean it was right?" he asked hoarsely. "No," Okubo said. "It means it was necessary. Those aren't the same thing. My uncle died in Hiroshima. He was 8 years old. His death was not right. It was a tragedy. But it was also part of a larger tragedy. A war that my country started, that my country refused to end, that would have consumed millions more lives if it had continued." He leaned forward. "Mr. Rochefort, you carry guilt for Hiroshima. My father carried guilt for planning Ketsugo, for being willing to sacrifice his entire nation rather than accept defeat. The emperor carried guilt for not ending the war sooner. We all carry pieces of the tragedy. No one person is responsible for all of it." "Then who's responsible?" Rochefort asked. "If everyone's just following orders, if everyone's just doing their duty, then who do we hold accountable?" "Everyone and no one," Okubo said. "That's the nature of modern war. It's too big for individual morality. It's a system, a machine made of millions of people all making small decisions that add up to catastrophe." They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Rochefort spoke. "I broke their codes. I read their secrets. I thought that if I knew everything about my enemy, I could make the right decisions. But the more I learned, the more complicated everything became. I knew the Japanese military was fanatical, but I also knew that Japanese civilians were just people, scared and hungry, and wanting the war to end. I knew Hiroshima was a military target, but I also knew it was a city full of families. I knew the bomb would save American lives, but I also knew it would create suffering beyond anything the world had ever seen." "So what did you do?" Okubo asked. "I made my recommendations based on incomplete information, and I've spent 30 years wondering if I made the right choice." "And what have you concluded?" Rochefort smiled sadly. "That some codes can't be broken. Some questions don't have answers. You just have to live with the uncertainty and try to be better the next time." Joseph Rochefort died 3 weeks later on a warm summer evening. His last words to his wife were, "I think I've finally figured out the pattern." She asked what he meant, but he was already gone. At his funeral, there were no military honors, no public recognition. The Navy sent a representative who gave a brief, classified speech about Rochefort's contributions to the war effort. Most of the mourners had no idea what he'd actually done. But among his personal effects, his daughter found something unexpected. A letter, sealed and addressed to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Inside was a simple note. "I was part of the intelligence team that helped select your city as a target. I do not ask for forgiveness. I have no right to it. I do not offer excuses. There are none sufficient. I write only to say that I have spent every day since August 6th, 1945, thinking about what happened, about the lives lost, about the suffering caused. I have tried to understand whether it was necessary, whether it was justified, whether it was right. I have found no satisfactory answers to these questions. I suspect there are no satisfactory answers. But I want you to know that the dead of Hiroshima were not forgotten by those who had a hand in their deaths. They have haunted me every day of my life." Perhaps that is a small punishment for a large crime. Or perhaps it is simply the price of living in a world where such things are possible. Enclosed is my Distinguished Service Medal. I do not deserve to keep it. Perhaps you can melt it down and use the medal for something that promotes peace rather than celebrating war. The letter was dated July 19th, 1976, one day before his death. The museum received the letter and the medal. They placed both in their archives, but did not display them. The curator, who processed the donation, wrote in her notes, "This man spent his life breaking codes. In the end, he discovered the one code that cannot be broken, The code of moral certainty in an uncertain world. Epilogue. Today, the shadows remain on the bridges and walls of Hiroshima. They've faded with time, but they're still there. Permanent reminders of August 6th, 1945. Joseph Rochefort's story remains mostly classified, known only to military historians and intelligence specialists. The public knows about the Enola Gay, about Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project, about President Truman's decision. But few know about the man in the basement who read the enemy's secrets and helped choose where the fire would fall. His legacy is complicated. He helped win the Battle of Midway, arguably the most important naval engagement in American history. His code-breaking saved thousands of American lives. He was brilliant, dedicated, tireless in his service to his country. He also helped kill 214,000 people in 2 blinding flashes of light. Both things are true. History contains multitudes, and so do human beings. We are capable of both great good and great evil, often in service of the same cause. The real question isn't whether Rochefort was a hero or a villain. The real question is, what do we do with power once we have it? How do we make impossible choices? And who gets to decide when mass death is justified? These are the codes we still haven't cracked. And until we do, the shadows will remain on the bridge, silent witnesses to the cost of victory and the price of knowledge. The man who cracked Japan's war code died, carrying secrets he could never decode. The weight of necessity, the burden of responsibility, and the eternal question of whether doing the right thing means you've done something right. Some codes, it turns out, are meant to remain unbroken,